Thanks very much. Thank you, Patrick. Patrick is not just was my graduate student. He's my only graduate student. As the only person who's written a dissertation with me. I don't know if that's because I'm so survived, yeah. But there were no deaths, but I hope it's not because I'm so fearsome. That can be right. But ancient philosophy is very demanding from the language and other points of view as well. And so it's rare that you find someone who's got all of the traits needed to be a good ancient philosopher. Now, the title of the paper is supposed to be somewhat surprising, Plato's Undivided Soul, because we're so used to seeing papers that are called Plato's Divided Soul. In fact, one of the most famous claims of Plato might be represented this way, and anyone who read the Republic might think, oh yeah, that's right. Plato says the soul has three parts: the rational part, the spirited or emotional part maybe, and the rational part. And in Book 4 of the Republic, he spends quite a bit of time, as a great discovery of mine, the soul is not simple, the soul is complex. And what I want to say is that that's an illusion. The soul is simple, despite Book 4 and the three parts. So what I'm going to do today is talk first about the rational part of the soul, and then I'm going to argue that the rational part of the soul is the only thing that is a soul, that the other so-called parts are not souls at all, and then I'm going to show that this view is what we find in other dialogues like the Phaedo, the Phaedrus, the Timaeus, and so on. And to do that, though, I'm going to have to introduce a few novel ideas, since most people think that the soul, even the immortal soul, can't be simple, despite the fact that the Republic seems to think that it is. And the reason it can't be simple is because in the Phaedrus, famously, the disembodied soul continues to have three parts. So it looks like you always got a tripartite soul, even when you're disembodied. So even your immortal soul is not simple, and therefore, surely, if there's one thing we can say about Plato, it's that his soul, the human soul, is divided. And I think that's not true. I'm going to try to show you that it isn't. So when reason is first introduced in the Republic, its functions seem to be predominantly practical. It's the element, this is on the handout, it's the element in the soul with which it calculates, the one that is really wise and exercises foresight on behalf of the whole soul, and so is its proper or appropriate ruler, that guards the whole soul and the body against external enemies by deliberating, and that has within it the knowledge of what is advantageous, both for each part and for the whole, the community composed of all three. So reason looks like what we think of in Aristotle as phronesis, or practical reason, that looking out for and knows the good of and tries to bring about the good of the soul. Later on, however, reason takes on a more contemplative or theoretical look. It's the element with which we learn, or one that is always straining to know where the truth lies, that it's appropriate to call wisdom-loving or philosophic, and that when it rules in someone's soul, causes him to think that the pleasures of making money or being honored are far behind that of knowing where the truth lies, and always enjoying some variety of it while he's learning, and to praise his own life as the most pleasant. And that sounds much more theoretical and, sort of like this knowledge that I'm into, not the good and looking out for you. When we recall that the philosopher's preferred life is one of contemplating the forms, our confidence might grow that if a fracture or fissure were to open up within reason itself, it would occur between 4 and 5. That is, between the practical or good-oriented part and the contemplative or theoretical part. So if wisdom were going to divide, it seems like it would divide there. Right? And of course, lots of people think that's just what Aristotle did. Right? Aristotle took Plato's soul, largely contemplative, and he discovered the need for two kinds of ways of thinking about reason, one practical and one theoretical. Now, I think that, just a little aside, I think that's exactly wrong. I think that Plato has only practical reason, and that he's no theoretical reason at all, and that what Aristotle discovered is theoretical reason. A little bit of evidence, though, might won't convince anyone who hasn't been reading the complete works of Aristotle lately, is that theoria, theoretical reason, and Sophia as the virtue of theoretical reason, those all occur kind of late. In the early ethical treatises and so on, they don't appear. It's only a bit later that you start getting theoretical reason kind of theorized or thematized. So, but you don't have to believe me about that for today's paper. I just wanted to say that I think that's what actually happens. Anyway, whatever it is, whatever comes first, it seems that Aristotle takes Plato's rational part and kind of divides it, its functions at least, into two. In Plato, no fissure does occur between those two, and this is in fact at least part due to a single doctrine or pair of doctrines. First, the most important thing to learn about is the form of the good, since it's by their relation to it that just things and others become useful and beneficial, so that if we don't know it, don't know the good, even the fullest possible knowledge of other things is of no benefit to us any more than if we acquired any possession without the good of it. The putatively theoretical knowledge described in 5 to 8 in the characterization of reason is thus knowledge of something with profound practical import. It's knowledge of the good, and that's a practical goal, after all. Second, while justice and beauty are, as you might say, ambivalent, as I put it, and that is, many people would choose things that are reputedly just or beautiful, even if they're not so, and to acquire things and form beliefs accordingly. Goodness isn't ambivalent in that way. No one is satisfied to acquire things that are reputed good, but on the contrary, everyone seeks the things that are good and disdains mere reputation, so that the good is what every soul pursues and for its sake does everything. That's very important. And I think you can just make it psychologically real to yourself. Suppose somebody said, do you want to be beautiful or to look beautiful? You might think, what would be the point of being beautiful if I didn't look beautiful? Whereas, if I look beautiful, who cares whether I really am beautiful? Isn't it all about how I look anyway? But when it comes to good things, you wouldn't think, do I want things that just seem good or that are really good? There you would think, oh, I really want them to be good. And I think that's the play that Plato has in mind, that in lots of cases, it's not quite sure, not quite clear what we value. Is it the thing itself or just appearing that way? And the joint import of these two doctrines is that the good is pursued because every soul wants good things, and so wants to know what things are really good, useful, and beneficial. Something only knowledge of the form of the good can provide, Plato thinks. It's not until you know the good that you've got a reliable yardstick for measuring what things are good. So since you want good things, you want to make sure that you're able to tell which ones are good, and you won't be able to do that, Plato thinks, until you know the form of the good. But what eventually emerges as the most beneficial thing, the one the Philebus calls the best good in a human being, is knowing or contemplating the very form of the good itself. So that just turns out this way. So first you seek the good because you want a reliable measuring stick for measuring the good things, the things that you want. But next it turns out that, in fact, it's also a good thing, but in fact the best one, is contemplating the good, the very form. So that pleasure of knowing where the truth lies emerges as the most pleasant pleasure, and the philosophical life around which it's organized emerges as the happiest. So it's because of those things that, if you like, no split arises between theoretical reason and practical reason for Plato, because it's the object of what we would take to be theoretical reason is the good, and contemplating it turns out to be the goal of practical life. What makes it just and appropriate for reason to rule the soul is explained in 2 to 4 in the little picture of the rational part that I provided. Reason is wise, it has knowledge of the form of the good, and exercises foresight on behalf of the whole soul by making use of that knowledge. When it rules, it isn't simply in its own interest, it isn't simply its own interest that it considers, but those of the other parts of the soul as well. The result, so when the entire soul follows the philosophic element and does not engage in faction or civil war, the result is that each element does its own work and is just, and in particular each enjoys its own pleasure, the best pleasures, and to the degree possible, the truest ones. So reason's good for everybody. Rule by reason in the soul is good for everyone, because reason is looking out for the good of all the parts of the soul, so to speak, and seeks their good as well. With each part satisfied by the best and truest pleasure available to it, civil war is banished, and from having been many, the reason-ruled soul becomes entirely one, temperate and harmonious. Everyone agree, all the parts agree. For the form of the good is an ideal of rational order of a sort, or rational unity, which as such induces a like order and unity in the soul of the one who loves and contemplates it. Now, though this rational order flows into the reason-ruled soul as a whole, its consequences for reason are different from those for the other soul parts. And the following passage, which I think is number 2 on the handout, it's kind of long. We must not think that the soul in its truest nature is full of complexity, dissimilarity, and conflict with itself. It's not easy, you see, for something to be immortal when it is composed of many elements and is not composed in the most beautiful way, which is how the soul now seemed to us. This is now we're looking back from the point of view of Book 10 of the Republic, back at the whole earlier part where the soul seemed divided into parts. Now we're looking back at it. We're getting this account. Yet both our recent argument and others as well compel us to accept that the soul is immortal. But what it is like in truth, seen as it should be, not maimed by its partnership with the body and other bad things, which is how we see it now, what it is like when it has become pure, that we can adequately see only by means of rational calculation. And you'll find it to be a much more beautiful thing than we thought, and get a much clearer view of the cases of justice and injustice, and of all the things that we have so far discussed. So far, what we've said about the soul is true of it as it appears at present. But the conditions we've seen it in is like that of the sea god Glaucus, whose original nature cannot easily be made out by those who catch glimpses of him, because some of the original parts of his body have been broken off, others have been worn away and altogether mutilated by the waves, while other things, shells, seaweed, and rocks, have been fastened to him, so that he looks more like any wild beast than what he naturally was. Such, too, is the condition of the soul when we see it beset by myriad bad things. But Glaucon, we should be looking in another direction, towards its love of wisdom. We must keep in mind what it grasps and the kinds of things it longs to associate with, because it is akin to what is divine and immortal and what always exists, and what it would become if it followed this longing with its whole being, and if that impulse lifted it out of the sea in which it is now and struck off the rocks and shells, which, because it now feasts on earth, have grown around it in a wild, earthy, and stony profusion as a result of those so-called happy feastings. And then you would see its true nature, whether multiform or uniform, or somehow some other way. But we have given a pretty good account now, I think, of what its condition is and what elements it possesses in human life. So when we look back, we're looking back at the soul as we see it maimed by its association with the body and all these other things. But if we were to see it in its true nature, then it wouldn't look that way. Though how it would look, whether multiform or powerful, we're not settling. But if it's immortal, it must be simple. That's the picture that emerges. The soul is partnered with the body, but also with other bad things, which, as the reference to feasting makes clear, are or include appetites. And as the shells, seaweed, and rocks that have become fastened to him obscure Glaucus's true nature, so these appetites obscure the true nature of our souls. An earlier passage completes the explanation by telling us in plainer terms what this true nature is. This is 3. The other so-called virtues of the soul do seem to be closely akin to those of the body. They really are not present in it initially, but are added later by habit and practice. This is justice, temperance, and so on. The virtue of wisdom, on the other hand, belongs above all, so it seems, to something more divine, which never loses its power, but is either useful and beneficial or useless and harmful, depending on the way it's led around. If this element of this sort of nature had been hammered at right from childhood and struck free of the leaden weights, as it were, of kinship with becoming, which have been fastened to it by eating and other pleasures and indulgences which turn its soul vision downward, if, I say, it got rid of these and turned towards truly real things, then the same element of the same people would see them most sharply, just as it now does the things it's now turned toward. What's struck free of the appetites and so on that get fastened to it by eating or feasting is the rational part alone, which is the locus of wisdom. That's the virtue that is being discussed. Hence, what we would see to be the soul's true nature, where these are removed, is reason, which, like the forms to which it is akin, is uniform, not multiform. The virtues other than wisdom are so-called virtues of the soul, apparently, because they're virtues not of reason alone, which is the true soul, so to speak, but of the soul when it's embodied. Now, these are virtues, temperance and so on, that you need because you've got a body, but they're not virtues of the soul simpliciter. They're virtues of the embodied soul. That's why they're so-called virtues of the soul. Now, one problem for this way of interpreting these texts is raised by the sentence N2, which you can see the little Greek bits, tikai, that are italicized in the first and second and third lines. It's not easy for something to be immortal when it's composed of many elements and kai is not composed in the most beautiful way. For it seems to allow that even a complex soul could be immortal if it were beautifully put together. So the thought is, right, you seem to be offered two thoughts, right, composed of many elements and not in the most beautiful way. So maybe it's possible that you're composed of many elements but in the most beautiful way, and then you're immortal. Takai, though, is often used to unite complements, where the second may be stronger than the first. And this is how consistency requires it to be taken here. The sense is when it's composed of many elements and, moreover, not composed in the most beautiful way. Only one possibility, I think, is in view, that of a soul that cannot easily be immortal because it is composed of many elements. To be sure, the complex soul does become, and this is from Book 4, entirely one when reason rules in it. But the unity it then achieves, since is one out of many, ekpolon, as he puts it, is not of the natural or metaphysical sort that constitutes an absolute barrier to disintegration, and that belongs to reason alone. You know, you can put things together, and you can put them together so that they're entirely harmonious, but you put them together and you can take them apart again. The rational part has a metaphysical unity. You can't take it apart. It has no parts. As naturally uniform and unified, reason is akin to the uniform and unified forms. And flowing into the whole soul, therefore, the rational order of the good meets in reason its psychological analog or partner. Nonetheless, even reason can be turned away from the forms toward the world of becoming. That's the leaden weights that pull it downwards, right? To which the other elements in the soul are akin. It's in this unnatural state that it appears complex and multiform, just as Glaucus does, even though he too is really simple and divine. The tripartite soul is truly complex. Right? So if you saw it as truly complex, you'd be seeing it as it really is. What appears complex but isn't is the rational part. As Glaucus is a simple divine being, we, to the extent that we are truly human, are our reason. And this now is 4. Fashion a single species of complex many-headed beast with a ring of tame and savage animal heads that it can grow and change at will. Now fashion another single species of lion and a single one of human being. But make the first much the largest and the second in size. Now join the 3 in 1 so that they somehow grow together naturally. Then fashion around the outside the image of one of them, that of the human being, so that to anyone who cannot see what is inside but sees only the outer shell, it will look like a single creature, a human being. Now the true human being is one of the components that are inside the shell that looks like the human being. What are the other two? The lion, that's spirited, the spirited part, and the multi-headed ring of snakes, that's the appetites. So the internal human being must be the rational part. So the only truly human thing in you, and you find Aristotle saying exactly the same thing in the Nicomachean Ethics, is the rational part. That's you. The rest is this agglomeration that looks like you because it's inside a skin of a certain sort. If we take this verbal image seriously, reason isn't just something immortal and so capable of autonomous existence when separated from the other mortal soul parts, but it's the true human being rather than a mere proper part of one. Appetite and spirit, by contrast, like the shells, seaweed, and rocks attached to Glaucus, are of a different order altogether. They're not persons, as we'd say, or human beings, or in that way souls. They're something else. Reason, the more divine element in the soul, always has sharp vision, but it can be controlled by vice, that is, by the rule in the soul of appetite or spirit. And the effect of such rule is to turn it downward toward the visible world of becoming, rather than allowing it to look upward toward the intelligible world of being and the forms to which it is akin. But the psychological power concerned with becoming is belief. Hence, it should be the rational part turned downward that does the believing. And though philosophically felicitous, the idea that it's the rational part of you that does the believing, like the doctrine of the unity and simplicity of reason, this can seem textually problematic. Let's take a look now at 5. Haven't measuring, counting, and weighing proved to be most welcome assistance in these cases of optical illusion and illusionist painting? You think one thing is bigger than another because of how far away it is, but then you measure them and you see they're the same size. Similarly, one thing looks heavier than another, but when you weigh them, that sort of thing. Ensuring that what appears bigger or smaller, or even numerous or heavier, does not rule within us, but rather what has calculated or measured or even weighed. And that's the task of the soul's rational element. But quite often, when it is measured and indicates that some things are larger or smaller than others of the same size, the opposite simultaneously appears to it to hold of these same things. You look in your rear view mirror, the side mirror, and it says objects are closer than they appear, but they still appear to be just where they did when after you've read that. They don't move in appearance, right? In the same way, when you look at the Muller-Lyer diagram, the diagram of the two lines that are equal, but one has prongs coming out this way and the other has little arrowheads. They look, the one with the little arrowheads like this looks shorter than the one where you put the arrowheads like this. They're actually the same length. And even when you measure them and you know they're the same length, they still look different, right? These optical illusions are robust in the face of knowledge. They don't disappear. That's an interesting fact, and it plays lots of roles in contemporary psychology of vision and how we're supposed to imagine it being integrated into the rest of our psychology. And didn't we say that it's impossible for the same thing to believe opposites about the same thing at the same time? So the element in the soul that believes contrary to the measurements and the one that believes in accord with the measurements could not be the same. But the one that puts its trust in measurement and calculation would be the best element in the soul. So the one that opposes it would be one of the inferior elements in it. That then was what I wanted to get agreement about when I said that. Well, we needn't worry about the imitation stuff. It's to reason, for example, that stick X appears longer than stick Y. And it's reason that does not believe in accord with that appearance that X is longer than Y. If these psychological relations appears to and believes were genuine opposites, one must be possessed by one subpart of this reason and the other by a different subpart, since the same thing cannot do or undergo opposite things, not at any rate in the same respect, in relation to the same thing at the same time. So if it appeared one way to reason, that they were the same length, right, and reason didn't believe that they were the same length, and believes and appears were opposite relations, then by the principle in Book 4 that's used to divide the soul, reason would be divided, because things would appear in opposite ways to us at the same time. That's not what happens, but a famous Plato scholar, Miles Bernier, reading this passage, takes it to divide reason for just this, on just these grounds. The grounds are bad, but they're superficially quite appealing. An inferior element in us believes, contrary to measurement, that X is longer than Y, in accord with what are its beliefs formed. The only candidate in view is what appears to reason. So if there's a part that believes contrary to reason, right, the only thing that, if you like, the only thing that it can be believing is an appearance to reason, right? Because that's what the passage tells us. It appears to reason this way. But this appearance cannot be the same as the inferior element's belief, which is only in accord with the appearance. Similarly, reason's own belief, as contrary to the appearance, must also be different from it. What appears to reason certainly conflicts, in this case, with what reason believes. But this conflict is not the sort that requires psychic division, since perceiving and believing are not the same psychological relation. Hence, the passage gives us no grounds for dividing reason into subparts or elements. It's not said that reason forms opposite beliefs, right? It appears one way to reason, but reason doesn't believe on the basis of it. Something else does, right? You don't get any conflict within reason. If you did, there would be problems. The phrase, one of the inferior parts within us, denotes appetite, which is the part that lacks reason. But spirit, too, is probably included in its denotation, since spirit can be bestial and become irrationally angry and so on. In any case, Socrates himself later cites anger as among the things that appearances and their imitation on the tragic or comic stage nurture and water when they should be dried up. That's why we get the odd shift from the soul being ruled by what appears bigger or smaller, that is, by something that isn't a soul part, to its being ruled by something that is such a part, namely reason. It doesn't matter what gets nurtured and watered into ruling the soul, as long as appearances are doing the watering and nurturing, the results will be bad. So you can talk this way. You can say a part rules the soul, or you could say that what appears to the part does the ruling, because the part then nods an assent to it, and if it has power in the soul, it makes the soul do that. So something in us, right, believes in accord with the appearance that the lines are the same length, or that the stick really is bent. Reason doesn't believe in accord with the appearance. The appearance in both cases to reason, it's the rational part of us that forms that appearance, but the belief that looks at the appearance, reason looks at it and says, I don't believe that. I've measured. I know which is longer. There is a part of us, though, that continues to believe that they really are the same length or longer, or whatever the way they appear. Though the text we've been considering does not present us with a divided rational part, it does present us with an inferior part, whether appetite or spirit, that has beliefs. And this is no anomaly. For temperance to exist in the soul, reason, appetite, and spirit must share the belief that reason should rule and not engage in any civil war against it. Moreover, assent and dissent are among the opposites that only a divided soul can have simultaneously toward the same thing. It's probably to this text, indeed, that ours refers, with belief treated as the equivalent to assent by a soul or a soul part. Now, so let me step back for a second and just try to catch you up to how you should be thinking here. Right? We believe things. What part of, suppose we were thinking in now Platonic terms, what part of us does the believing? Right? Well, look what we've got in this little passage. We've got reason believing in accord with an appearance, contrary to an appearance. Things aren't the way they appear. The sticks look the same size, but actually one is longer than the other. How do I know that? I've measured them, and I've formed my belief in accordance with my measurement. There's also a part in us that believes contrary to, that believes in accord with the appearances and contrary to the measurements. Now it looks like we've got beliefs in different parts of the soul. Right? We've got beliefs in reason, we've got beliefs in appetite, we've got maybe beliefs in spirit, and this is a little puzzling psychologically for how we're supposed to think. It now sounds like the parts of the soul, like appetite and spirit, are like little mini souls. They can do lots of things, including form beliefs and so forth. They sound like souls, right? They sound like they've got the cognitive resources that reason has, maybe not to the same degree or extent, but they can believe together with reason. That sounds awfully much like they can do all these things. But I think this is itself an illusion. A belief can be either what's believed or assented to, a content of some sort. I believe that it's raining. Or it can be the cognitive attitude of assent. What do I do to that it's raining? I believe it. That's my relationship to that content. And we call both of them beliefs. What do you believe can be about your psychological relation to a content, or what the contents are that you believe. In a fully virtuous, reason-ruled soul, content and assent are always united, since the soul parts assent in unison to whatever content reason provides. That's just what it is to have a unified soul. The parts all believe together, right? So they believe in a unified soul, right? Assent to a content and the content, they always go together. But in a soul ruled by one of the other soul parts, the two elements in belief can come apart. In the case of a perceptual belief, for instance, The relevant content, as we saw, is an appearance to reason. On the basis of measurement and calculation, reason dissents from this appearance and so believes contrary to it. But this doesn't mean that the soul's ruling element will follow suit. It may assent to the appearance. Since it rules the soul, its assent will carry the day, affecting subsequent belief, calculation, and action. So what you've got is a content that's in reason, and then you've got something that can either assent or dissent to the content, right? And that assenting or dissenting is what's crucial. But the content is formed by reason. So when you say, does this part believe? You can be asking one of two questions. Does it form the content? Does it determine the psychological relation? It determines the psychological relation, but not the content. And the passage tells us that. We just have to parse it out a little bit. So when we ask what does the believing in the tripartite soul, we have to be clear about which side of belief we have in mind. What makes available a belief's content is always the rational part. What determines the attitude adopted to that content, whether assent or dissent, is the part of the part that rules in the soul. Since a full belief consists of both a content and an attitude to it, only the rational part forms beliefs autonomously or without help from the other parts of the soul, because it alone provides contents. The other parts, by contrast, form beliefs only in cooperation with reason, which provides them with contents to assent or dissent, or to reject. What these soul parts have on their own are not beliefs proper then, but subdoxastic dispositions to assent or to dissent from contents. They're not fully believers, right? Because they can't form contents. The fact that these dispositions are acquired and shaped by habituation, not by education proper, which Plato goes on and on about in Book 7, is of a piece with this conclusion. So you have to be careful. It's not the other parts of the soul that form beliefs in the full-blooded sense. They do assent or dissent from contents, but those contents are only available because they're in a soul with reason that can form the contents. So they're not really autonomous believers. And that means we don't have to attribute to them the kind of psychological complexity that we have to attribute to something that can full-bloodedly, on its own, autonomously believe. And what's true of beliefs in this regard must also be true of appetites, desires, and any other psychological functions involving content that's broadly cognitive or propositional. The content, whether perceptual or intelligible, involves the rational part, while the attitude to it, the assent or dissent, pursuit or avoidance, is determined by the part that rules the soul, which may be the rational part itself. It follows that nothing in the soul is autonomously capable of any of these psychological functions except the rational one, though it may need to be in a body to perform some of them, like perceiving, and this is a clear sense, therefore, in which the rational element alone is a soul. That is, fully equipped with the kinds of psychological capacities that we think to be required for being a person or having a soul. The other parts don't function that way. They have a different sort of psychological role. We don't have to attribute that kind of complexity to them or think of them as little people inside doing things. Our rational part is a little person. That's a human being inside us. They're like snakes and lions. They don't actually have content of their own. They just do things to the whole thing on the basis of what appears. Okay. Now, the idea that the rational element in the soul, or the rational soul as we may now more usefully call it, is alone, properly speaking, a soul, rather than some sort of element, is confirmed by accounts we find elsewhere in Plato's dialogues. Here's a fairly early example from the Phaedo. And this is, now we're in Souls and Persons, this is number 6 on your handout. Soul is most similar to what is divine, immortal, and intelligible, uniform and unsusceptible to disintegration, and always remains in the same state and condition as itself. Body, on the other hand, is most similar to what is merely human, mortal, unintelligible, multiform, susceptible to disintegration, and never in the same state as itself. Notice how soul is situated up with simplicity, uniformity, unchanged, other stuff. The reason for the difference is that soul is incomposite, body composite. Now I'm going to read a piece that I didn't put on the handout, it's very short. What has been put together and is naturally composite is the sort of thing that's susceptible of being divided in the respect in which it was put together, whereas if something is really incomposite, then it alone is really incomposite, if indeed anything is. So, put something together, in the respect in which you put it together, you can take it apart. Only things that aren't put together are insusceptible of being pulled apart. As a result, psychological capacities attributed to parts of the incarnate soul in the Republic are attributed in the Phaedo not to the soul, but to the body. At the same time, souls that have lost the bodies they have on Earth, although not perhaps those they have in Hades, can have the sorts of appetites, fears, and types of character that could hardly be possessed by rational soul alone. And that's often taken to be a contradiction between the Phaedo picture and the Republic picture, as it looks like immortal souls have psychological attitudes that only complex souls can have, but immortal souls are simple, and so they can't. And so people said, the Phaedo has a different vision of the soul than the Republic, and since the Republic is later, the Republic must be better, etc. Now, rather than see this as an out-and-out contradiction, we should perhaps see it as prefiguring, if not presupposing, a view like the Republic's. Rational soul is alone a soul, simple, indissoluble, eternal. But when embodied, it acquires characteristics that disguise its true nature. Thus, when a complex embodied soul is divided in the respect in which it was put together with the body, what we get is rational soul on the one hand, and some other elements that are not themselves souls, but accretions to it on the other. So I say, don't worry, don't get too excited yet and decide there must be an out-and-out conflict. Rather, try to read the Phaedo a little bit more like I've been proposing you read the Republic. Only the rational soul is immortal, it's simple, and so forth. Now, there are some other accretions to rational soul that come from being embodied, but don't yet leap to the conclusion that because the immortal soul has them, that means there's conflict with the Republic. And you'll see why. You'll see all this will get spelled out in 1 second, but that's just the thought. A later portrait from the Phaedrus, which is one of the best known of all, represents reason, spirit, and appetite as a charioteer and a pair of horses. And that's number 7. I won't go through it because it's familiar, no doubt, to you. And anyway, all it says is the soul is like a charioteer in a chariot with 2 horses, a black horse and a white horse. The white horse is spirit, the black horse is appetite, the charioteer is reason. That's it. It's sort of like the Republic, but with some equine imagery added. The perfectly winged soul that travels through air or space is entirely non-solid and bodiless. When it loses it, I'm continuing from this passage, when it loses its wings, it takes on an earthly body, and the resulting psychophysical compound is called a living creature. But loss of wing power is a matter of degree. The gods that end up on the stars and planets are also immortal souls that have lost something of that power, but because their horses and charioteer are better than ours, they never sink down to earth, but stay on heaven. So the gods, not the demiurge and the Timaeus that makes everything, but the gods of Greek religion, the heavenly bodies, right, are themselves represented as charioteers with horses. It's just that their horses are better behaved than ours, and they get that as they are made and put down on the planets that they're put on, right? So we're like them in that respect. Okay. It's just that we've got less ruly horses and our wing power is a bit less. They've got better wing power, they can fly better through the heavens, and their horses are better behaved. Though Plato sometimes allows the stars and planets themselves to be called gods, he's also explicit, as he is in the Republic and here in the Phaedrus, that this is like calling the snake-like element in human beings, it's like calling the snake-lion-human complex a human being. It's harmless enough as long as you don't take it literally. It's only the inner rational part that's a human being. For the stars and planets are psychophysical compounds, and just as rational soul alone is the true human being, so it's the souls of the stars and planets that are truly gods. Look at this passage from the Laws, which is passage 8. Consider the stars and the moon, the years, months, and all the seasons. These are all divine beings for for Plato. What other account can we give except this same one? Since a soul or souls are evidently the causes of all these things, and good souls possessed of every virtue, we'll declare these souls to be gods. So it's not the planet. When you look up and see Mercury or Venus or Mars, that's not a god. That's a soul embodied. And the only thing that's really a god is the soul. And that's what that Laws passage says. So it isn't the celestial bodies that are truly immortal, but the souls that have laid hold of them. If we imagine otherwise, it can only be because we don't understand what a god is. That's what Plato says in this passage. Because the stars and planets are not immortal, they can, in some sense, be divided into body and soul. Yet they will never, in fact, come apart into these two components when the demiurge, because of something the demiurge explains to them. And this is what he does in 9. Thus is the demiurge talking to the gods. God's works divine, whose maker and father I am, whatever has come to be by my hands cannot be dissolved without my consent. Now, while it's true that everything that's put together can be dissolved, look at that claim. Everything that's put together, so the three parts of the soul are put together, so they can be dissolved, right? Still, only someone evil would consent to the dissolution of what has been beautifully fitted together and in its good condition. That is why you, as creatures that have come to be, are neither completely immortal nor completely exempt from dissolution. Still, you will not be dissolved, nor will death be your lot, since you have received the guarantee of my will. Now, God has put it together. God could take it apart if he didn't will the good. It can come apart in some sense. It won't come apart, though. Notice these are important modal differences. These manufactured gods are thus a nice intermediate case. They do not have the absolute indissoluble unity possessed by rational soul, but they do have a type of unity that mortal creatures, whose souls and terrestrial bodies can come apart, lack. Metaphysical unity is all or nothing. Psychological unity is a matter of degree. Since acquiring a body involves acquiring accretions to rational soul, the pair of horses, the same holds for the unity of a complex soul. Its unity isn't absolute and metaphysical, but mediated by demiurgic will. It can be held together or pulled apart. It all depends on what the demiurge wills. Now, we're used to thinking of souls as immortal and less used to thinking of them as transmigrating. Yet that, too, is something Plato made a part of his portrait of them. At the spindle of necessity, at the Book 10 of the Republic, for example, where souls are choosing their next incarnations, saw the soul that once belonged to Orpheus choosing a swan's life, and a swan changing to the choice of a human life. So you can have souls that transmigrate, not just within a species, but across species. And in the Timaeus, too, reincarnation retains its prominence. And now we're in 10. Once souls were of necessity implanted in bodies, and these bodies had things coming to them and leaving them, the first innate capacity they would of necessity come to have would be sense perception, which arises out of compelled disturbances. This they would all have. The second would be erotic desire mingled with pleasure and pain, and they would come to have fear and spirit as well, plus whatever goes along with these, as well as their natural opposites. And if they could master these, their lives would be just, whereas if they were mastered by them, they would be unjust. And if someone lived a good life throughout his proper span of time, he would at the end return to his dwelling place in his companion's star to live a life of happiness that agreed with his character. But if he failed in this, he would be born a second time, now as a woman. And if even then he still could not refrain from evil, he would be changed once again, this time into some wild animal, that resembled the wicked character he had acquired. And he would have no rest from these toilsome transformations until he had dragged the massive accretion of fire, water, air, earth into conformity with the resolution of the same and uniform within him, and so subordinated that turbulent, irrational mass by means of reason. This would return him to his original condition of excellence. Choice is not mentioned in this picture as it is in about choosing lives, and that might be an important difference. Nevertheless, the picture still presents us with the need to make sense of a single soul that acquires erotic desire and spirit only when it acquires a body, and that can subsequently be placed in very different sorts of animal bodies with different consequences for it. And it doesn't take much to see that rational soul is alone well suited to play both these roles. For the complex tripartite soul has erotic desire and spirit already, and so cannot acquire them. And if the soul is to learn from an incarnation, or make a choice of another one, or to subordinate anything at all to reason, it must have a rational cognitive capacity of some sort. So it isn't this. When you get the body of a swan, right, it's your rational soul that's getting on that body because it has to learn things while it is a swan that it can then use in making its next choice of reincarnation, right? And of course, it can't take on spirited desires and appetitive desires by being incarnate if it already has them because it's tripartite. So it's only the rational soul that can play these two roles. Now, the mention of a soul's companion star refers us back to the Phaedrus, where souls are portrayed as followers of different gods, or in the language of the Timaeus, as associated with or located on different stars or planets. So if you're a follower of Mars in this life, you end up, when you die, if you've been pretty decent, you end up being on Mars. And then you're closer to the things you're contemplating. And if you're a follower of Zeus, which is best of all, you get closer still. So depending on what god you sort of owe your allegiance to, that determines what your post-mortal fate will be. At a point in their revolutions, these gods travel to the summit of the arc of the heavens, as the Phaedrus puts it, and from there they can view the region above the heavens and the forms that dwell there. So it's a sort of here you are going around and there's the edge of the universe, and sometimes you get close enough to it that you can actually stick your head out of it and see the forms that are beyond it. It's a picture that Aristotle tells very similar terms. But in order to do this, their souls must enter this upper region. When these souls that are called immortal have reached the top, they travel outside and take their stand upon the outer part of the heavens. This is 11. And positioned like this, they're carried around by its revolution and gaze on the things outside the heavens. So there you are going around on your chariot, on your star, and you're sort of where you reach your head up, and when you get close enough to the boundary of the heavens, your head goes outside, and then you see the forms. That's the image in the Phaedrus. At other points in this revolution, such a soul is inside the heavens, and so is both embodied and tripartite, although its body isn't of the earthly sort that a human soul takes on when it is incarnated terrestrially. And the Timaeus, the bodies of the gods are mostly fire. So the gods are embodied, right, even when they're up there on their things, but they're not terrestrially embodied. They're embodied with celestial fire, what the form of the bodies are. Okay. When it travels outside, though, it apparently leaves even these astral bodies, or whatever we are to call them, in some sense behind. It's as if, yeah, it's still got the astral body the God has there. It's going around, but now it's close enough to the outside of the arc of the heavens. Its head can stick out, so even though it leaves in some sense behind the astral body, it doesn't become dissociated from it. Right? You can't pull apart completely, but you can, as it were, get away from it enough that you can look outside because of where the body is. That's talking about the gods now. That this soul, it's this sort of soul that is called immortal. That is the rational soul, is clear. This now is 12. This region, outside the heavens, is occupied by being that really is. That is, without color or shape, intangible, and that only the captain of the soul, the understanding, can contemplate. And that is the kind of thing with which true knowledge is concerned. Thus, because a God's thought is nourished by understanding and knowledge that is pure, and so too every soul that is concerned to receive what is appropriate to it, it's glad at last to see what is, and is nourished and made happy by contemplating what is true, until the revolution brings it around in a circle to the same point. That's about the God, right, seeing the forms by being at that point where its chariot takes it close to the arc of the heavens so that it can stick its head outside. So, but in order to do this, their souls, the understanding part of their soul, rational soul doesn't lose contact with the astral body altogether. That's clear, right? It's still being carried around. It continues to be carried around by its revolution. But because of the paths these astral bodies reliably travel, rational soul is able regularly to escape from the realm of the body while yet remaining attached to it. It's as if its head gets outside, but it's still attached to the body. So understanding, this is a picture, of course, but you see how it's kind of operating. Now, a human soul that's the follower of a particular god also travels to the heaven's summit, provided it has trained its appetitive horse well, something not all such souls succeed in doing. But its charioteer or a captain, rational soul or understanding, can keep itself in the realm of the forms only intermittently, subjected it is to disturbance by the horses. So now let's compare. The god gets all the way up there, its head is outside the universe, it's contemplating the forms, but it's got well-trained horses. They never pull it back in when it's up there. But we're such that even when we get up there, that our horses can pull us back in again. So we're more intermittently seeing the forms when we're following along, even when we're on the same planet as the god. As a result, he says, it scarcely catches sight of the things that are, while another captain now rises, now sinks, and because of the compulsion exerted by its horses, sees some things but not others. So we catch glimpses, we see bits, we're less in contact. It's how much of the forms its captain does manage to see, and how often, that determines what happens to it. So there you are on your planet. What's going to happen to you when you're embodied on Earth? How are you going to be embodied? That depends on how much your head was out of the universe and looking at the forms when you were following around on the god. It may remain on its star or planet, following in the orbit of its god, but whenever through inability to follow it fails to see, and through some mischief is weighed down with forgetfulness and deficiency, and because the weight loses its wings, it falls to earth. So sometimes, right, you haven't fed yourself enough on those immortal forms, as it were, by seeing them, and so what happens to you next is your soul loses its capacity to winged power, and it's pulled down to earth. If a soul is good enough never to be sent to earth at all, we should presumably imagine its life on the model of that of its god. Sometimes, but less reliably, less frequently, and less continuously than he or she, its rational part gets to travel outside the heavens, while yet remaining attached to its astral body, and so to the spirited and appetitive elements that the horses represent. But even if a soul isn't good enough for that, its fall to earth is, so to speak, graduated. In its first incarnation, no soul, however minimal its winged power, is planted in any wild beast. That fate can only occur in much later incarnations, and only to those whose wings resolutely refuse to grow. Instead, souls are initially planted in terrestrial human beings, snake, lion, human complexes, with different types of characters. Thus, the one that saw most shall be planted in a seed from which will grow a man who will become a philosopher, or a lover of beauty, or one devoted to the muses. The second in the seed of a law-abiding king, or someone like fit for generalship and ruling, until in the eighth place we reach the seed from which a sophist or a demagogue will grow, and in the ninth a tyrant. And so it continues through 1,000-year cycles of reincarnation and choices of lives, until after 10,000 years, each soul returns to the place from which it has come. Now, a god's rational soul, while it is initially separate from every sort of body, is never subsequently in that condition, right? When the demiurge plants the soul on a planet, plants the god on a planet, it's the rational soul that is the god that gets planted. And then that soul, that god, gets a body which it never loses, although it could come apart where the demiurge, okay? Once it's joined to an astral body by the demiurge, it cannot be separated from it. That's why the gods cannot suffer the equivalent of death by having their rational soul come apart from the only body they have, their astral body. We can suffer death. That's one of the things that distinguishes us from them. But we do it not so by having our rational soul come apart from our astral body. None of the portraits of soul envisages that. If they did, our souls would be better off than those of the gods, not worse, because we could actually get back to the best of all possible places outside the heaven by losing even an astral body. Instead, we die by having our complex soul come apart from our earthly body. We die on Earth, not on our home star. Whether we say that it is our complex soul or our rational soul that gets incarnated matters when what is alone absolutely immortal and simple in us takes on that sort of astral body it has on its home star or planet. Therefore, our souls, like those of the gods, are always complex, always tripartite, always embodied. Yet to the degree that we can make sense of that beginning, that is, when we got our astral body, that is, from the moment when the rational part of our soul was placed in a body at all by the demiurge. If we can make sense of that, then we can make sense of ourselves as having had once upon a time a simple soul. That once, just like a god, we can say the same thing about the god. Right? Thereafter, our souls are always complex, always tripartite. Yet to the degree, as I say, that we can make sense of this beginning, we can say that it's our rational soul alone that we must take to be ourselves. That's why, as an immortal thing, we should be seriously concerned with what happens to us throughout the whole of time. This is the Republic, rather than in the relatively short period from childhood to old age. In the Republic, Socrates identifies rational soul with the human element in the snake-lion-human complex that is a terrestrial human being. In the Phaedrus, he's apparently more circumspect. This is 13. I'm not yet capable, Socrates says, in accordance with the Delphic inscription, know thyself. I inquire into myself. He says, I'm not quite capable of knowing myself in accord with the Delphic inscription. So I inquire into myself to see whether I'm actually a beast more complex and appetite-consumed than Typhon, or both a tamer and a simpler creature, sharing some divine and untyphonic portion by nature. The question he raises is one we would think better posed by leaving human beings out of the picture. For while we might concede that rationality is something that human beings have a portion of by nature, and might even concede that there's something divine about it, we would surely hesitate to conclude that all there really is to a human being is reason. We would surely think that there's more than that. Appetite and spirit, to stick to things already in play, seem equally important to being human. Now, person, of course, is something of a term of art, right? But if we agree that a person is, and this is John Locke's famous, he's arguably the person who introduced person into philosophy with just the kind of meaning it now has in contemporary philosophy. An intelligent being that has reason and reflection and consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places, then there's much to be said for thinking that only rational soul, only the soul's rational part is a person. For as portrayed in any case, rational soul must in some way remember what happens to it in its many different incarnations, whether in animal or human beings, and especially in those glimpses it catches of the forms where it is, as it were, as out of the body as it's possible for it to be. This is the last part, I think, 14. For a soul that has never seen the truth will not take human shape. For a human being must comprehend what is said in accord with a form arising from many perceptions and being collected together into one through calculation. And this is a recollection of those things that our rational soul once saw when it traveled in company with a god and treated with contempt the things we now say are, and rose up into what really is. The answer to Socrates' question, then, is that he is a person, a rational soul. This person is by nature simple or incomposite, but by demiurgic fiat, it's part of the sort of appetite, spirit, reason complex that a human soul is, that is a human soul, and is so, moreover, even when the terrestrial body it inhabits is that of another species of animal. We're never without a body of some sort, except for that moment at our creation, so to speak, when the demiurge placed us into a universe at all. At that point, we got an astral body, and that, like the gods, we never lose. When we die, right, we lose this body, but not our astral body. And it's the failure to see the importance of the astral body that has led people to think that the rational soul couldn't possibly be the only one that's immortal. Why? Because when Plato describes immortal souls, they always have three parts. They always have three parts because we always, right, once after that first incarnation, we always have a body of some sort, and that's enough to give us the tripartite soul. It's not that our soul is intrinsically, metaphysically complex. It's simple. It's that we always see it, no matter where it is, whether on the home star or here on Earth, it's always associated with a body of some kind, and so always has a complex nature. But that's just true as it is of the gods by demiurgic fiat. It's not a metaphysical fact about us. Thank you.